conifers. He went out into the clearing and began to lay them out in a pattern. He came back and broke off more, and still more. Very slowly, because the lines had to be large and thick, the letters SOS appeared in dark green on the clayey open space. The letters were 30 feet high, and the lines were 5 feet wide. They should show distinctly from the air. "I think," said Lockley with satisfaction, "that we might get something out of this. If it's sighted, a copter might risk coming in after us." He looked at her appraisingly. "I think you'd enjoy a good meal." "I want to say something," said Jill carefully. "I think you've been trying to cheer me up, after saying something to arouse me, which I needed. If the creatures aren't monsters, they'll never actually let anybody loose who's seen that they aren't. Isn't that true? And if it is—" "We know of 6 men who were captured," insisted Lockley, "and I was one of them. All 6 escaped. Vale may have escaped. They're not good at keeping prisoners. We don't know, and can't know unless it's mentioned on a news broadcast, that he's out and away, so there's absolutely no reason to assume that Vale is dead." "But if he saw them, when he was fighting them—" "The evidence," insisted Lockley again, "is that he saw monsters. The only reason to doubt it is that they blindfolded 4 of us." Jill seemed to think very hard. Presently she said resolutely, "I'm going to keep on hoping anyhow." "Good girl," said Lockley. They waited. He was impatient, both with fate and with himself. He felt that he'd made Jill face reality when, if this SOS signal brought help, it wasn't necessary. And there was enough of grimness in the present situation to make it cruelty. After a very long time, they heard a faint droning in the air. There might have been others when they were trudging over bad terrain, and they might not have noticed because they were not listening for such sounds. There were planes aloft all around the lake area. They'd been sent up originally in response to a radar warning of something coming in from space. Now they flew in vast circles around the landing place of that reported object. They flew high, so high that only contrails would have pointed them out, but atmospheric conditions today were such that contrails did not form. The planes were invisible from the ground. But the pilots could see. When one patrol group was relieved by another, it carried high-magnification photographs of all the park, to be developed and examined with magnifying glasses for any signs of activity by the crew of the object from space. A second lieutenant spotted the SOS within half an hour of the film's return. There was an immediate and intense conference. The lengths of shadows were measured. The size and slope and probable condition of the clearing surface were estimated. A very light plane, intended for artillery spotting, took off from the nearest airfield to Boulder Lake. And Lockley and Jill heard it long before it came in sight. It flew low, threading its way among valleys and past mountain flanks to avoid being spotted against the sky. The 2 beside the clearing heard it first as a faint mutter. The sound increased, diminished, then increased again. It shot over a minor mountain flank and surveyed the bare space with the huge letters on it. Lockley and Jill raced out into view, waving frantically. The plane circled and circled, estimating the landing conditions. It swung away to arrive at a satisfactory approach path. It wavered. It made a half wing-over, and its side slipped crazily, and came up and stalled, and flipped on its back, and dived. And it came out of its insane antics barely 20 feet above the ground. It raced away as close as possible to touching its wheels to earth. It went away behind the mountains. The sound of its going dwindled and was gone. It appeared to have escaped from a deliberately set trap. Lockley stared after it. Then he went white. "Idiot!" he cried fiercely. "Come on, run!" He seized Jill's hand. They fled together. Evidently something had played upon the pilot of the light plane. He'd been deafened and blinded, and all his senses were a shrieking tumult, while his muscles knotted and his hands froze on the controls of his ship. He hadn't flown out of the beam that made him helpless. He'd fallen out of it. And then he raced for the horizon. He got away. And it would appear to those to whom he reported that he'd arrived too late at the distress signal. If fugitives had made it, they'd have been overtaken and captured by the creatures of Boulder Lake, and there'd been an ambush set up for the plane. It was a reasonable decision. But it puzzled the pilot's superior officers that he hadn't been allowed to land the plane before the beam was turned on him. He could have been paralyzed while on the ground, and he and his plane could have yielded considerable information to creatures from another world. It was puzzling. Lockley and Jill raced for the woodland at the clearing's edge. Lockley clamped his lips tight shut to waste no breath in speech. The arrival and the circling of the plane had been a public notice that there were fugitives here. If the beam could paralyze a pilot in mid-air, it could be aimed at fugitives on the ground. There could be no faintest hope. Wholly desperate, Lockley helped Jill down a hillside and into a valley leading still farther down. He smelled jungle and muskiness and decay and flowers and every conceivable discordant odor. Flashes of insane colorings formed themselves in his eyes. He heard the chaotic uproar, which meant that his auditory nerves, like the nerves in his eyes and nostrils and skin, were stimulated to violent activity, reporting every kind of message they could possibly report all at once. He groaned. He tried to find a hiding place for Jill, so that if or when the invaders searched for her, they would not find her. But he expected his muscles to knot in spasm and cramp before he could accomplish anything. They didn't. The smell lessened gradually. The meaningless flashings of preposterous color grew faint. The horrible uproar his auditory nerves reported ceased. He and Jill had been at the mercy of the unseen operator of the terror beam. Perhaps the beam had grazed them by accident, or it could have been weakened. It was very puzzling. End of Chapter 4.